Welcome back to another edition of the Simone NBA Show. I'm your host, Jack Simone. You can follow me on Twitter at Jack Simone NBA, and we are brought to you by Heavy.com, Heavy on Sports. You can follow them on Twitter at Heavy on Sports. And if you're watching on YouTube, which you should be, subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is Heavy. And then you can check out all their other social handles to the side of me. Again, I don't know my left or rights, but it's to the side of me. You'll see it on YouTube. We got a nice episode today. We've got Sam Quinn of CBS Sports here to talk Lakers, the Pat Bev trade, and the Russell Westbrook situation. And we've got Thomas Darro of Heavy to talk Nets, their upcoming season, the Kevin Durant situation, and moving forward the future for them. And wrapping it up in Jack's Corner, I'm going to be talking about the New York Knicks and why I don't think they're a playoff team. But I like the RJ Barrett move. You'll hear more from me then. But yeah, we're going to throw it over to the talk with Sam about the Lakers first, followed by the Nets, then the Knicks. And yeah, enjoy. Thank you guys for listening. And I'd like to welcome Sam Quinn of CBS Sports to the show. We're going to talk some Lakers. How you doing today, Sam?
Jack, I'm good. It's been I was about to say it's been a quiet offseason for the Lakers. I'm going to say it's been more of a disappointing one so far, but we're trending in the right direction now.
Yeah. I remember I was talking to you during the season or something, and you're the NBA reporter at CBS, and you were talking about how you were, not glad that you don't have to cover the Lakers anymore, but it's definitely a stressful endeavor.
Yeah, I'll say I still write a fair bit about the Lakers, but
Yeah.
when they're bad, I mean, I had a little bit more leeway last year by the end of the year because, my bosses aren't masochists, right? They're not going to make me watch every single Russell Westbrook game in February, When the Lakers are good, I'm still happy to write about them. But yeah, the end of last year was definitely a bit of a slog.
Yeah, we got the Austin Reeves show though. That's a plus. Austin Reeves.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are glimmers of positivity on this roster. The overall picture is not great.
Yeah, of course, of course. Well, you mentioned the roster, and they did make their first, I'll say their first major move, obviously signing Troy Brown Jr., Juan Toscano Anderson. They made some minor moves at the start of the offseason, but they traded Stanley Johnson and Talon Horton Tucker to the Jazz for Patrick Beverley. Did you mention something? I know I saw it on Twitter. I forget if it was your tweet about them including Stanley Johnson, how you were upset about that, because I know there were some Lakers fandoms that were less than pleased that Johnson was a part of the deal. But regardless of that, I don't know if that was your tweet or some other general thoughts.
No,
I thought, what do you think about the Pat Bev trade?
No, I'll start with Stanley because he was the only wing-sized human on the roster
Yeah.
that defended it aside from LeBron, obviously, that defended it a reasonable level last year. Now, don't get me wrong, Stanley Johnson is a flawed player. He can't make a three. There's a reason he bounced around the league since, getting picked in the lottery by the Pistons. But he was like a playable wing-sized guy in the regular season, and this roster doesn't have many of those. They're down to, Troy Brown's a little small. Juan Toscano Anderson, there's a reason he wasn't in the playoff rotation for the Warriors. So yeah, giving up a guy like that, it does hurt a little bit. But Patrick Beverley is, I don't want to say exactly what they need. What they really need is a bigger trade. But he is the sort of player that they need on the team, right? They had nobody on the roster who could defend guards at the point of attack. Beverley obviously does that quite well. And statistically, at least, he's the best shooter on the team, right? Before the trade, the highest career 3-point percentage on the team was Kendrick Nunn's, 36.4%. Patrick Beverley is not Steph Curry, but getting up to a 38% 3-point shooter or a little bit lower than that is having somebody else like that is pretty important on a LeBron team, right? So it was a good trade. I look at it as a good start. If they don't make any other moves, they're still a playing team. But if they make another move after this, maybe they can be something better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you saw the guard problems last year. You hear the buzz saying, okay, Austin Reeves, maybe he'll move into that starting role. Kendrick Nunn, there's still, I guess, this looming question mark because he's been out for however long with the bone bruise. We don't have to go too deep on this, but what do you see the starting and closing lineups being like for the Lakers next year with this Pat Bev and in not accounting for any moves, which we'll talk about in a couple seconds?
Yeah, I would say I do think that there will be at least one more trade. But if we just go off of the roster right now, Darvin Ham seems really determined to start Russell Westbrook. I disagree with that. I'm in the camp that I would rather send him home like John Wall. But if he's going to be on the roster and he's going to start, you have to assume that if he's playing, he'll be starting. I would think that Beverly is probably the likeliest option at the two, just because I am at the front of the Austin Reeves bandwagon. He didn't shoot particularly well next year. I think that'll improve, but I think that's something he's going to have to prove over the course of the season. So I'm going to assume that Patrick Beverley starts shooting guard over him. LeBron and AD obviously at 3 and 4. And then I'd give Thomas Bryant the slight edge over Damian Jones right now for the center slot, just because I think they want a shooter at center and Damian Jones can't shoot. So Thomas Bryant, I'm not going to say he's, what Marc Gasol was 2 years ago, but I do think he's a viable enough shooter that they would feel comfortable starting him. That said, I don't think that Russell Westbrook is going to be the starting point guard. If, let's say, opening night, maybe, but I think we're going to get to, like, at the very least, if there's not an offseason trade, I think we'll get to like game 25, game 30. And at a certain point, they're just going to have to acknowledge this doesn't work, right? Like, if they haven't made a trade by that point, like, look, Patrick Beverley makes more sense with LeBron and AD. Like, that's why they got him. I'm not going to sit here and say second year undrafted free agent Austin Reeves is better than Russell Westbrook. We saw the Russell Westbrook experiment last year, and it was doing nobody any good, right? There's a reason he was getting benched down the stretch of games. So I would assume that if the young player continues to improve, they would look at this and say, you know what, we want to continue to invest in our younger guys, who we might want to keep around for a while. Maybe we don't have to close Russell Westbrook anymore, or maybe in the middle of the season this doesn't work. Okay, bye Russ. Like, go John Wall yourself. Like, go hang out at home, and we'll call you if we need you. So I think there's a chance that Russell Westbrook is the starting point guard on opening night. I don't think he's going to finish the season, even if he's not traded, as the closer at point guard, as like this, nail it in guy like LeBron and AD as a primary part of the team.
Yeah, and you mentioned that you think there'll be more moves this offseason. I agree with that because, I mean, let's call a spade a spade. It's hard to imagine Pat Bev and Russell Westbrook on the same team in any stretch of the imagination. But you see all these rumored, potential deals on the table. The Jazz and Knicks 3-team deal Lakers could get involved in. Obviously, the Pacers one has been there for what seems like the entirety of the offseason. I know you've tweeted about it before, but what do you see as the ideal return in a Westbrook trade if they do end up making one?
Yeah, I'm very much in favor of the Miles Turner Buddy Hield trade. I think that's the right combination of, first of all, you get two shooters, which, like, that's no small thing when Patrick Beverley is the best shooter on your roster. Miles Turner, I think, has gotten a little bit overrated as a shooter. He's fine. He's not a great shooter. Buddy Hield is significantly underrated as a shooter. Like, I believe he has like the fourth or fifth highest total 3-pointers made in the season. I'd have to look that up, but he's made, I believe, if not 300, at least in the high 200s in a single season. The percentage hasn't always been great, at least in the last few years, but he's been playing in Sacramento with very little playmaking, very little around him. You have to figure he would really benefit from playing with LeBron. And then Miles Turner is, if not the best rim protector in the NBA, Rudy Gobert is, in the top 3, 4, 5, right? Like, somebody who would allow Anthony Davis to play power forward on defense, which is what he ultimately wants to do. And if you look at the most successful stretch the Lakers have had since the championship run, it came early in the 2020-21 season when Anthony Davis was essentially playing center on offense and power forward on defense. That was when Marc Gasol was shooting and passing from the high post, but not really playing much, mobile perimeter defense. Davis was doing that, right? And they started off 21-6 when those guys were starting together. Obviously, things fell apart from there, but I think you'd have a similar fit with Miles Turner, where he'd do a lot of shooting from behind the arc and then protect the rim, so Davis can do what he does best on defense, which is roam around, cover a lot of space, help everywhere.
Yeah, I think that trade is probably the one that makes the most sense, and it hinges on, will they trade that 2029 first round pick? Will the Pacers settle for less? And I mean, not that they wanted Talon Horton Tucker, but now he can't be thrown in a deal, so there's no extra sweetener, I guess. But the Jazz trade is also intriguing because you see, reports saying Danny Ainge is, eager to get the Donovan Mitchell thing done. Now that Beverly is already a Laker, I know I, wrote something about how the best return, or I said something here about the best return would be, a package of 4 players from the Jazz because they're probably looking to get rid of some of their veterans and taking on an expiring contract could be worth it. But they already have Beverly. So now the best package you can look at coming out of Utah for the Lakers would probably be, Conley, Bogdanovich, and then one of Clarkson or Beasley. I can't imagine they'd throw both of them in a deal like that. But Danny Ainge apparently covets the Lakers picks. What do you think the best return out of Utah would be, and how does it stack up to Indiana? I know you like Indiana's package the best, but how do they compare in your mind?
Yeah, Bogdanovich is somebody that I think could play a major role on a playoff team, be a starter. My problem is we've seen Utah lose in the playoffs twice in a row now. Really 3 years in a row if you want to go back to the bubble for the exact same reasons, right? They can't defend on the perimeter, and what kept happening over and over again was that, whether it was Conley or Clarkson or even Royce O'Neal, who's now in the Nets, or, pick Donovan Mitchell too, pick your perimeter Jazz player, they would get roasted one-on-one, and against five out offenses, Rudy Gobert would either have to stick in the corner with the shooter, or he'd have to leave a shooter alone, and you would make an open three, right? Like those guys, I'm sorry, Jordan Clarkson can't defend at a playoff level. Mike Conley at this stage of his career can't defend at a playoff level. So I think they could be useful players. I just don't think they have championship upside. Maybe, I mean, Evan Fournier's defense, I mean, he's flown under the radar over the last year or so because he was on a Knicks team that wasn't good. But that net Celtics series from 2 years ago was not kind to him defensively.
Brutal.
So, we've seen the Knicks as a possibility too as part of a 3-team trade with Mitchell. I would just say ultimately, like if you're the Lakers, I don't understand the appeal of giving up one pick for a lesser package, right? Like I don't understand the appeal of like trying to middle ground this thing and saying we're okay giving up, a potentially very high pick in 27, keeping 29, but doing that for the sake of winning 48 games. It just doesn't really make sense to me. And I mean, Danny Ainge, don't get me wrong, he's not a perfect GM. He understands big picture asset valuations. And if he's looking at the Lakers and saying, I want their unprotected picks in 27 and 29, well, he has a pretty good history of trading for people's unprotected picks, right? Like, I think Danny Ainge understands what we should all understand, which is that the Lakers are going to be bad in 2027 and 2029. Like, I feel pretty comfortable saying that for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is LeBron James's age. So I would just assume that eventually Indiana's going to come to terms with the fact that there isn't a better trade out there for Miles Turner and Buddy Hield than what the Lakers are offering. Maybe the second pick has to be protected. Maybe there's a swap. I ultimately think they're gonna settle on something, but we'll see. I mean, the fact that it hasn't happened yet and it's been 2 months into the offseason is definitely concerning.
Yeah, and that would create a pretty complete starting lineup. You're talking Beverly, Buddy Hield, LeBron James, Anthony Davis, Miles Turner. That's at least a playoff team in the West, even though the West is stacked. I think they'd very clearly do better than the Lakers did last year. But one of the last things I just want to touch on quick is those are the two packages you're hearing for a Russell Westbrook deal. But a couple weeks ago, we heard, oh, they have more, offers out there. These aren't the only things. And you look around the league. I mean, you can draw up a Spurs package that could potentially work with a couple of their players to dump Westbrook. The Hornets package of Hayward and Rozier that was floated at the early stages of the offseason. Are there any packages around the league that you think are potential that could potentially come out of the woodwork and be the Westbrook deal? Or do you think Indiana's as good as done?
I think the Charlotte situation only made sense when they were trying to save tax dollars, and the Miles
Yeah.
Bridges situation has gone in such a way that they don't need to do that anymore. So I would assume that Charlotte is out. I'm not going to say San Antonio's out, but their history is not pleasant when it comes to the Lakers, right? Like Greg Popovich is not known for being magnanimous with the Lakers, so
Yeah.
I would assume the Spurs are out. Look, if you really wanted to just, galaxy brain this thing, you could find some bad long-term contracts around the NBA that make sense to trade for Russell Westbrook. But if we haven't heard them by now, I find it pretty unlikely that we're going to. Now, maybe
Yeah.
if Westbrook is on the team in December, I don't know, some team could look at this and say, well, we're going to have to tank anyway. We've had some injuries. Let's make a trade. But ultimately, I think it comes down to either Utah or the Pacers. There's a reason they're still in this thing at this stage. So if there was a third team, I mean, I guess the Knicks, if there was another team involved in this, I would assume we would have heard it by now that they would still be competitively in it.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. The last thing I do want to ask you before I get you out of here is you don't have to go too in detail. What is your next season early prediction for the Lakers? Obviously, we don't know what the Westbrook package will be. We can assume it's Hield and Turner or a Jazz package, but how far do you see them going and how well do you see them performing in the regular season?
Well, the regular season, I think, is going to be tough either way because you have to rest LeBron and AD, right? Like, even if they're healthy, I don't care. You can't play them 82 games. The whole point is getting them through June healthy. And frankly, like, if the last few years have been any indication, you have to rest them a significant number of games to make that possible. So, their best case in the regular season, like for me, if they're number 6 and they're not in the play in, that's a win. That's great. Now, I think there are scenarios where it gets quite a bit uglier, right? Like the opening schedule for the Lakers is really daunting, and that's very unusual. The NBA typically likes to backload the Lakers schedule because they want the primary Laker games to be after football season has ended just for TV's sake. They didn't this year, and that's going to make the early season pretty uncomfortable, right? Like if Westbrook is still on the team, you're looking at a 10 15 game start where you might only win 4 or 5 games. So yeah, I mean, I don't think the regular season is going to be great. I think if the Indiana trade is what ultimately happens, they have a puncher's chance, right? Like I wouldn't call them the championship favorites by any means. I would say the Warriors are better, the Clippers are better, the Nuggets are better, but they'd have a chance, right? If things break their way, I think they'd have a shot with that much defense, that much shooting around LeBron and AD. Maybe if things go right, they could win it all. If it's the Utah package, congratulations on losing in the first round, I guess. And if it's Westbrook, I don't care. Why would we even talk about them? They're no different than I don't know the Knicks at that point. They're a 500-ish team, if that, probably worse. So the only trade that would really get them into the championship picture for me is the Indiana trade. Even that's not a guarantee by any means. Like I want to stress that I'm very optimistic about that package, but like there's no version of this where you turn back the clock to 2 years to when the Lakers open the season the favorite. That's not happening. If the Lakers think that trade is out there, they're going to be disappointed. But there are trades out there, or rather, actually, there is one trade out there that at least gives them a puncher's chance, and that's what I'd be going.
All right. Well, I mean, I think that wraps a bow on the Lakers. Thank you for joining me. I appreciate you taking the time to talk Westbrook and the whole drama of the offseason.
Hope we're close. I hope we're getting close to a resolution here.
I think we're almost done as well. All right. Thanks, Sam. Appreciate it.
Back anytime.
And I'd now like to welcome in Thomas Darro, heavy writer for the Brooklyn Nets and Miami Heat, I believe, here to talk Nets, KD, the whole situation. How you doing today, Thomas?
I'm well, Jack. It's good to be with you. This is my first time being a guest on a show. I'm always the one doing the interviews, so it's interesting to be on this side of things.
I'm glad to have you. Plenty to talk about. I mean, the Nets have kind of dominated the headlines this offseason anyway, so I'm sure you've been full of content, full of stuff to write about. It's been a nice summer. KD kind of, he's the man of the writers, I guess this summer is what he was. But now he is returned to the Nets. With Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons, the new quote unquote Nets big three. I mentioned this to you before we started recording, and I said it on last week's episode. I want your thoughts. My theory was that Kevin Durant was never going to be traded. Not that he didn't want to be traded, but then the Nets were never going to trade him. Because if you look across like the board, they set these ridiculously high asking points. And then whenever they received those, asking points, i.e. Jaylen Brown, they said, no, we want Marcus Smart too. Right? They always asked for more. They were never satisfied. I don't think they were ever going to trade Kevin Durant. I think they were always intent on keeping this core of Kyrie, Ben Simmons, and them together. And that's kind of what happened. I'm curious to know your thoughts. Am I crazy, or does that sound about right?
No, and how can you? Especially, well, do you think that changed after what Rudy Gobert got, or what the Jazz got for Rudy Gobert? Because once he did that, like how I'm a Jazz fan actually, and so how the Jazz got that for Rudy Gobert astonishes me. I think it's also made the Donovan Mitchell trade impossible for them too. But you have to get back more than what the Jazz got for Rudy Gobert, and that was going to be impossible based tender. And so, no, I think they knew we're going to have an incredibly high asking price if we get it. Cool. If not, we're going to have KD either way. He likes to play in first here. KD might hold camp, and then you hear about the ultimatum he gives Joe Tsai, but then ultimately decides me and decide that, okay, we'll run it back and we'll stay together. And so I agree. I don't think a trade ever going to happen. Unless they got the huge asking price, and then it was a win-win.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like you said, it's tough to trade the best player in the world. Arguably, I mean, I have Giannis, but we can debate that another day. So yeah, it's tough to trade KD. Jaylen Brown package with Derek White in a pick that might have been close to there. Anything else around the league, you're kind of like, I mean, I'd rather have Kevin Durant anyways. But now Brooklyn Nets are back. In theory, at least on paper, they look like, in my opinion, a top 4 team in the Eastern Conference. But we've said that for the past 4 seasons. And it'll all come down to whether or not Kyrie Irving will play, whether or not they can get along, whether or not Kevin Durant can stay healthy. But they have the depth. TJ Warren signing is a good one. They also brought in Edmund Sumner, Markieff Morris. They brought in wing depth. Patty Mills came back. They've got a good squad there. Where do you see them finishing in the East? Which teams are better? Which team do you think they're on par with?
Yeah, I think for top 4 is when I was looking at the list and the standings is top 4 is where I can see them. It's questions on, are they going to be better than teams like the Heat and the Sixers? I think those are the teams I had a hard time where it's like I think they'll be even to or possibly better against, but I think it depends on their core is how the 3 of them play together. It's going to be interesting. They say they want to play Ben Simmons at center. What a rotation with the 3 of them with Ben Simmons will be like. I think it's exciting to think of that because if it all works, like Ben Simmons creating shots for players like Seth Curry, KD, Kyrie, Joe Harris, like all these shooters, they could potentially be a really solid team, and they have the depth off the bench with Royce O'Neal, Markieff Morris, and then you add TJ Warren, and that's a big variable as well. But they have depth. They have all these things. So I think depending on how they play together, I could see them being the 3rd team in the East underneath like the Celtics, who obviously got better. And then the Sixers, I think, are up there too. And those are the teams I worry about most with them. And then the Bucks as well. And so I would put them in the top 3 is what I thought. Because I think the Heat got worse this year. They didn't do much. They spent their summer wrapped up in the Kevin Durant and Donovan Mitchell sweepstakes and didn't really add anyone and didn't replace PJ Tucker at all.
Tucker.
Kevin Martin or Caleb Martin, I'm not sure how he's going to fit as a starting power forward.
Yeah, the Heat have kind of fallen off in my eyes. Obviously, the Heat, they'll still be good, but the way I see the East, and you can disagree with me or agree with me, I think the Bucks and the Heat, in my opinion, are probably that 1-2 at the top, and then I think there's a little bit of a gap, and then the Nets, Sixers, and then Heat are on the borderline of like with the Raptors in that spot. But I think the East is very competitive, and I think the scary thing about the East is that a lot of these bottom teams got better. Right, you look at the Cavs. I think they got better with the Ricky Rubio signing. You look at the Knicks. I think they got better, even though I don't think they'll be amazing. Excuse me, with the Jalen Brunson signing. I even think the Wizards got better. I think they're getting slept on. I think Lonzo Ball coming back. The Bulls are going to be better. So if the Nets want to be this top team in the East, they're going to have to do the work in the regular season. And that's the part that worries me because they haven't been able to string together a healthy or consistent regular season since 2 years ago. And then 2 years ago, the injuries came crashing down to the playoffs. Do you think that's possible? And what factors do you think come into play during the regular season and playoffs in terms of injuries, personalities, etc. for the Brooklyn Nets?
I think the big question is like the Kyrie stuff, everything looks to be good. And I think Kyrie has to be kind of on his best behavior because you saw they gave him the opportunity to to seek sign and trades and basically go out and find if you can find a team that will give us the right picks or the right assets for him, we'll let you go, Kyrie. And like you can pick and choose. And the only people that were interested were the Lakers. And so I think he has a lot to prove if he wants to get max money. And so I think he will be back in the conversation of like, I think you have to have good regular season cooperation from him. And like, we'll see how things play out with KD. I think KD's here to play. And I think they have something to prove this year is how they do together. Ben Simmons is still a question mark for me. What do you think about Ben Simmons? Like, it's hard to know how he comes back.
Yeah, I still think Ben Simmons, I've actually said this for years. I don't know if it's at this point anymore, but I've always said if you put Ben Simmons on the Bucks in Giannis's place, he'd win an MVP. And I still stand by that to a degree, although the injuries definitely bring some sort of question because he hasn't played in a year at this point. And the last time he did play, he was making some questionable decisions. But I think if you put him at center or have him run the power forward and like play make from the post, I think that's where he'll be best. As a ball handler in transition, that's obviously the highlight of his game as a point guard. So you still got to let him do that. But in terms of the half court offense, I think he needs to be a big man now. I don't think he can be playing the point guard. And I think that's perfect for what the Nets are doing because they have Patty Mills, Seth Curry, all these, wings and guards, and they don't really have a backup center for Nick Claxton. So if you transition Ben Simmons to the full-time center, which I don't know how comfortable he'd be in doing that, et cetera, but I think that's where Ben Simmons can be most effective. And I think he can still win a defensive player of the year. I still think he's that good on defense, even if he's, half of his former defensive stuff. He's still a defensive player of the year candidate, in my opinion, which is crazy. So I think he has the best weapons he's ever had to work with in Brooklyn. This isn't a slight to Joel Embiid. I just don't think they fit together because he's always
Yeah.
in the post, and that's kind of where Ben Simmons needs to be. Having two of the best perimeter players in the history of the NBA in Kyrie and KD around him, plus like you said, Seth Curry, Patty Mills, all these other shooters, I think he'll be in the best position to thrive. And I think if he plays the center position, I think he could average 10 assists. I think he could average like close to a triple double. So I'm high on Ben Simmons, but I'm also, leveling my expectations a little bit. I think if nothing goes well, he could still like play half the season.
Yeah.
That's I think the downside of Ben Simmons.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be interesting, and I think, like, you nailed it, like, they're gonna be a spacing nightmare for teams, like, with what he can be Kyrie can be a secondary off the ball offense
Yeah.
and Simmons can create for him there, or you can run offense through Simmons in the post, and I think for the most part, he can defend any big man. Like, I don't know a big man in the East that he won't be able to guard. Like, we've seen him guard Giannis. We've seen him play defense. I think it would be interesting how he plays Embiid, but that's the only team that I think he would really struggle with
Yeah.
defensively.
I agree. I'm looking forward to watching it at the very least. I hope he comes back great. When he's out there, he's fun. So I'm hoping Ben
Totally.
Simmons comes back fun. But the last thing I wanted to cover before we get you out of here, next off season, Kyrie will be a free agent. And the whole thing is, oh, he's gonna be a Laker next year. Do you think that it's a foregone conclusion that Kyrie will be a Laker next season? Or do you think there's a chance that he and KD play well together? And then second to that, if you do think he'll be a Laker, what does KD do? Does this happen just all over again?
Well, that's been the thing all summer is there's been all the Kyrie has been a back and forth. Like, he wants out, he's forcing his way out, and then wait, he actually never wanted to leave. He just wanted a long-term contract. And so it's all been confusing, but I think if he truly wanted out, I think he could have made things. It was already messy. And they were sick of
Yeah.
him. Like, there was reports from Vince Goodwill in the middle of the summer that the team is so done that, like, they don't want Kyrie to even step foot in the arena again, and they'll consider waiving him if they were able to keep KD. And so things have changed, and I think if he really wanted to, he could have forced his way out this offseason. So something about me thinks that with it being like his hometown team, and the team he dreamed, there's a reason that they chose Brooklyn. And if they can sort things out, I still think if Kevin Durant's here, that he will be back. And it's going to be interesting how the Lakers play out too. Like, how much does he want to go to the Lakers? As exciting as it is to reunite with LeBron, like, I don't know, you just always see that third person on a LeBron team usually kind of gets the share of the blame if they aren't winning championships. It's happened with Kevin Love, it happened with Chris Bosh, like, they kind of become the scapegoat for these LeBron teams, and does Kyrie really want that? Of course, he'll probably be the number 2 over Anthony Davis, but it's just kind of that
Yeah.
new mix, and I don't know, I think he likes New York, I think he likes Brooklyn, and so I see him staying if depending if this season goes good, I don't see why he would leave.
Yeah. I can see that too. It's definitely going to be fun to watch again, and we might just get another summer of rumors, which for the content is fine by me. Anything for the content. But yeah, I think that's all I had on my sheet today. I'll leave you with this. Do you have any hot takes about the Nets or the NBA? And I'll let you go after that.
I think the Marquise Morris signing, I don't get it. The Nets, like,
Really?
every year will add an old aging vet that it just doesn't make sense, that I just think there's other people on the market that they can go for, and so I'm like, when I think of a Nets move in the last, 4 years, it's always like, what vet can we add that sounds good and it's a name, but it's just gonna sit on our bench and not do much. Last year, it was like LaMarcus Aldridge and Blake Griffin, and sure, they
Yeah.
might play spot minutes, but they don't really contribute, and it's more, I think, to appease Kyrie and KD, and, like, even Stein said, it was they wanted a respected veteran, but I think it hurts them as well, and then you see, like, I don't think they know how to use them, and they'll then when it's the stretch for the playoffs when they let James Johnson go, I think no one really understood that move that they chose James John or Kessler Edwards over James Johnson. but and that they could have used him in the playoffs because the only forward that they were playing was Bruce Brown. But anyways, that's a long-winded way of saying I just think I don't like these vet moves that they make, and I don't know what Markieff Morris is going to contribute where they have so many wings with Warren, O'Neal, Sumner, all these people you mentioned. That's just going to be a hard fit, I see.
Maybe they're big branding it, and they're predicting a Nuggets Nets finals where Jokic will have to battle it out with Markieff Morris on the court,
and he can get his revenge. Or maybe if like Marcus is eliminated, maybe they'll do like a Parent Trap thing and switch places. But I also don't know which one you want. I think Marcus Morris. I wouldn't understand the signing either. So but yeah, I just think it's an interesting move and things that kind of make me question times when I'm like, oh, I think there's someone else you could have got there with the available spot.
For sure. Definitely questionable with those aging vets. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me, Thomas. I appreciate it. On Twitter at Thomas Darro. You can check out his work at heavy.com. Thomas Darro writes Nets and Heat. Did I miss anything? Just those two?
No, you got it. Yeah. Thank you, Jack.
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks for joining me.
Appreciate Have a good one. Okay. Bye-bye.
And lastly, in Jack's corner, I want to talk about the New York Knicks. The Knicks just signed guard RJ Barrett to a 4-year rookie extension that could get up to $120 million, roughly $30 million a year. That's kind of the standard, it seems, for young players nowadays. $30 million a year contract on average sounds about right, and that's about right for Barrett. Barrett becomes the first Knicks player, first Knicks first round draft pick to agree. I'm sorry, I'm just going to read this from Woj because it confuses me a little bit. Barrett's extension ends a remarkable 23-year drought for the Knicks. He's the franchise's first draft pick to agree to a multi-year contract extension after his rookie deal since Charlie Ward in 1999. The Knicks have been bad at drafting. I mean, that tells you what it is. You look at Kevin Knox, you look at Frank Ntilikina, who Frank's all right still, but they've been bad at drafting. RJ Barrett ends that. Mitchell Robinson counts a little bit, but second round pick, a little different. I don't know. RJ Barrett is signed with the New York Knicks for 4 more years. But what that now affects is the Donovan Mitchell situation. Going to read Woj's tweet again. New York's Leon Rose set a Monday deadline with Utah to reach an agreement on a trade for Mitchell, or the Knicks would commit to the Barrett extension, sources said. Knicks Jazz closed gap on deal points in recent days on a Mitchell trade, but neither would go further. I also saw reports saying that the Jazz declined a package that the Knicks offered them of RJ Barrett and 2 first-round picks. Where does that leave Donovan Mitchell? I still think he ends up getting moved this summer, and I still think it's to the Knicks. But now the Knicks are going to have to give up more draft capital, and I still think they should, because I think a core of Jalen Brunson, RJ Barrett, and Julius Randle is not good enough. Having those 3 players, Brunson, Randle, and Barrett is not enough to be a playoff team. It's a good core. It's a good start, but it is not a top 6 team in the East. It might not even be a top 10 team in the East. Maybe that's crazy for me to say, but you go down the line, Boston, Milwaukee, Miami, Philadelphia, Brooklyn. That's a top 5. Toronto's right there too. That's 6. New York's not better than any of those teams. They're not better than any of those teams. Then my personal next tier is Chicago, Atlanta, Cleveland. I don't think New York's better than any of those teams. They might be barely lumped in with that crowd, but I don't think they're better than any of those teams. I put New York on par with the Wizards. I think with Beal, Porzingis, and then the additions of Will Barton, Delon Wright, Monte Morris, getting back Daniel Gafford, having all these players, Denny Avdia, young players, I put New York on par with the Wizards, fighting for that 10th and final spot. I even think the Wizards are better, but maybe that's a hot take. At best, the Knicks were the 4th seed in the Eastern Conference with a record that would have been the 6th seed in last year's Eastern Conference. Julius Randle had the best year of his career, and it doesn't look like he's going to get back to that point based on what we saw last year. It looked like, if anything, in my opinion, that was probably a one-off year. And Randle's not a bad player, but he's also not a player worth what the contract he's on. RJ Barrett, I think, will still be an all-star, but even if he is an all-star, I don't think that changes anything. I take that into account. Jalen Brunson could also be maybe borderline all-star. I put him in maybe that like CJ McCollum tier. If he's not an all-star, but he could be eventually. Maybe he's in that borderline Mike Conley, CJ McCollum type thing before Conley made the all-star team with the Utah Jazz a couple years ago. I don't think they're a playoff team. But I think getting Donovan Mitchell makes them a playoff team. So I think that's why you have to give up the picks if you're the Knicks, because you've already committed to building for the now. signing Jalen Brunson to that massive contract and having Julius Randle around on that deal commits them to building for right now rather than the future. And because of that, I think you have to make the Mitchell deal, or else they're not going to be good enough. I think they would struggle to make the playoffs with their current core. And maybe that's harsh, but I just don't see it. Like I said, every team that I mentioned, I think is very clearly better than the Knicks. I think there's a chance you could lump New York in with that tier of Cleveland, Chicago, excuse me, and I'm forgetting one, and Atlanta. But I think all of those teams are very clearly better. And so that's why I think they'll struggle to make the playoffs, and that's why I think you have to consider the Mitchell deal. How many picks do you give up? Personally, I think you give up as many as it takes. I mean, I think they have 8 tradable first-round picks. Don't quote me on that, but I think you give up 6 of them. 6 of them, Obi Toppin, Emmanuel Quickley, and then Rose or Fournier, whoever you'd rather. 4, Donovan Mitchell, I think is something the Jazz should do. I mean, Danny Ainge is trying to squeeze every last asset out of New York, but I think that's something you have to consider. And then for the Knicks, I think you have to do it because of the way they built the team. Now, at the same time, I don't think they should have given up Barrett for Donovan Mitchell, because then you're in a spot where the fall off between RJ Barrett and the next player is probably Evan Fournier in terms of who can start there. Maybe Quentin Grimes, and you've heard reports saying that Tibbs and the Knicks like Quentin Grimes more than RJ Barrett. I think that's baloney. I think that's awful. I mean, I like Grimes as much as the next guy. I think he has the potential to be a good player, but Barrett has all-star potential. It's screaming right in the face. His numbers took a dip a bit last year, but at the end of the season, you saw him put up these monster numbers. I think he needs to be the number one option in New York unless they do a Donovan Mitchell trade. I don't think Randall should have the ball as much. I think Barrett needs to be the guy with the Knicks that has the ball, that's doing all these things, because then I think he can be an all-star. I think Jalen Brunson's a fine point guard to be alongside him. You've seen all these memes and images on Twitter saying, oh, these 3 players are worth $370 million. That's a bit crazy. That's definitely crazy, but RJ Barrett needs the keys unless Donovan Mitchell is there. But at the same time, if Donovan Mitchell isn't there, the Knicks aren't a playoff team. So, decisions to make. There's definitely some tough decisions that have to be made in New York. Extending RJ Barrett was, in my opinion, the correct place to start, because I don't think they should have included him in a package for Donovan Mitchell. And you could turn around and say, oh, then why did the Jazz decline that offer of RJ Barrett in 2 seconds? Because I don't think that's worth it for the Jazz, because RJ Barrett might be a good place to start a rebuild, but I don't think by the time, they put a competitive team around him in Utah, I think RJ Barrett is going to be ready to help a team compete for the playoffs in the next couple seasons, and I don't think that's the timeline the Jazz are working on. I think they value picks more, which is probably why they'd say, okay, no, we'd rather younger players and picks, or probably RJ and more picks, but now they're looking at younger players and picks, which I think Obi Toppin and Emmanuel quickly fit that better, because I think they'll take a little bit longer to develop. But they still have that upside. So I think those 2, Fournier and a bunch of picks, is the package that I think that will happen, but I think that's what should happen, and that's what I've always thought should happen. So yeah, the Knicks are in a tough spot. I don't see them as a playoff team, and I just outlined it. Milwaukee better, Boston, Miami, Philadelphia, Brooklyn, Toronto, all better. And then that next tier of Cleveland, Atlanta, Chicago is where the Knicks are fighting to be in. But even then you're fighting for what? One of the bottom 3 play-in teams, and then one of those teams won't make the playoffs. I just mentioned, how many teams did I just mention? Boston, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Miami, Brooklyn, Toronto. That's 6. And then the next 4 is play-in teams. So yeah, that next group, Chicago, Cleveland, Atlanta, New York. They're fighting for a play-in spot. 2 of those teams will not make the playoffs. And if I had to hedge my bets, I think Washington will be up there too, on par with the Knicks, because I don't think the Knicks are in that group. So it's tough. I think they need to make a Donovan Mitchell trade if they want to stay competitive, but at the same time, they're hesitant to give up all those picks. It's a mess, and I think extending RJ Barrett was the right move, but the Knicks right now are not a playoff team. All right. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening or watching. If you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel if that's where you are. Heavy on YouTube, just Heavy. Thank you again to Sam Quinn of CBS Sports and Thomas Darro of Heavy for joining me on this episode. Going to have more guests in the future, so you guys can look forward to that. I'm your host, Jack Simone. You can follow me on Twitter at Jack Simone NBA. Check out all my work on Heavy, Celtics blog, and all these other outlets. But yeah, thank you to Heavy for sponsoring the show. Heavy on Sports is their Twitter account. And if you're on YouTube, which you should be, head on over to YouTube. If you're not, you can check out all of Heavy's other social handles at the side of me. So thank you guys so much for listening. Peace out.